Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Humanities Centre for this very special event in our fall programme. As some of you will know, a substantial part of this semester's programming has been devoted to the great theme of the ocean, the first part indeed of our 3-year exploration of natural landscapes and human meaning. You may have seen our gorgeous billboard on the hill up here as you drove into campus today. So we've been thinking about the various ways that human beings engage with the ocean as an object of research, of artistic inspiration, and of the imagination. And it's in this context that I am truly delighted to introduce this evening's distinguished guest and author of the recent book, Merpeople, A Human History, Vaughn Scribner. Educated at Kansas State University and then at the University of Kansas, where he earned his PhD, Dr. Scribner is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Central Arkansas. His first book focused on the role of the tavern in early American civil society and was, I think, brilliantly titled In Civility. INN. The emphasis on 18th century American history informs Dr. Scribner's current work, which concerns the defeat of the British military in revolutionary America. But he will be talking with us this evening about his work on mermaids, merpeople, as I mentioned in the aforementioned book, published by Reaction Books in 2020. It really has been, and I've told Vaughn this, it's really been one of my favorite reads of the year. It's a wonderful and lavishly illustrated book, engagingly exploring the presence of merpeople in religion, art, history, scientific inquiry, popular culture, and business. Shortlisted for the prestigious Catherine Briggs Award, presented annually by Britain's Folklore Society, it received glowing reviews, including from the incomparable Marina Warner. While the reviewer's words in the Fortean Times, I think, are worth quoting. The reviewer said, "This is a thoroughly enjoyable and scholarly read, drawing on a wide variety of sources. Scribner succeeds in giving these fascinating folk the recognition they deserve." The global appeal of the book is such that it has been already translated into Japanese and is currently being translated into Chinese. As I noted a moment ago, it really is a truly beautiful book. It's miraculously inexpensive. And I highly recommend getting hold of a copy. Christmas is coming, etc. To that end, our very good friends from Warwick's of La Jolla are here and will be happy to sell you a copy, which the author will be very happy to sign for you too. Thank you to Julie and to John for being with us today. That is enough from me. Now, please welcome Vaughn Scribner.
Well, thanks so much for coming out. I've been absolutely amazed at your campus. First off, before I even go into anything else, I've been going on runs and walks, and it's probably the most beautiful campus I've ever been to in America. And I'm so impressed with the energy on campus as well. Now, I can talk all day about this, but I'm going to keep this to 40 minutes today. I usually started off with kind of talking about the book because Reaction Books, the publisher of this, really did an incredible job on this book. I chose the images and wrote the text, but they're the ones who put it together. And it's heavy, it's well made. I'm very proud of the book as a thing. I think it's something that we don't always think about as much in this age of ebooks and everything, but it really is a piece of art in the way they created it. And I'm really happy with that. But I really want to get to how did I get here? As Brian mentioned, I studied and was trained as an 18th century British American historian. Never in my wildest dreams as I was doing my research for my dissertation did I think that I would be writing a book at some point about mermaids. And it's become kind of my thing now. It all started actually, in my research, I read a lot of diaries and journals and newspaper articles. I'm researching something like taverns or mineral spring spas, or it's slavery in the Caribbean. I'm having to pour through a lot of resources because there's not exactly a tavern section, for instance, in the archive, where you have to just go through everything and try to bring things out, kind of like a raccoon looking for shiny things. And so as I was reading this account from an Englishman named John Jocelyn, who was in America in the early 18th century, at one point, he notes how he and his friends are in this bay, and this merman clambered up over the side of their boat and he hacked its arm off, and it bled purple blood and went back into the water. And I thought, what the hell is this? And so I kind of put it aside. I thought, well, I'll get a good tweet out of this, if nothing else. This is weird. The next day, I'm reading Ben Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, and I couldn't believe it. He is reporting this merman sighting in Brest, France. And at that point, I knew there was something here that I had to look into. And I remember telling a friend, one of my colleagues, like, yeah, I think I'm going to write something about mermaids. I'm like, what? Well, okay, it kept going. As I started doing more research, I decided there's something here with these 17th and 18th century explorers and philosophers and scientists, as we call them now. They seem to be really interested in what we now generally believe to not be real. I don't believe in mermaids. And so John Smith's name kept coming up. Allegedly, John Smith had seen a mermaid on one of his first trips over to Virginia, early 17th century. And all these historians, and believe it or not, there are more books on mermaids than I thought there ever would be. I thought, there's no one else. This will be the first one. But there have been all these other books, and they all cited this instance of John Smith seeing this mermaid. And I thought, well, this is a pretty big name to claim to see this mermaid. They're quoting him, they're citing him. But as I went, I kept finding that they were citing other secondary sources. So I thought, I've got to get to the primary source on this. And just around this time, this early Americanist blog had reached out to me to write a blog post for them. I hadn't written anything about mermaids yet. And I was going to write a piece about 18th century philosophers researching mermaids, but I got hung up on this John Smith thing. And I kept diving, pun intended. And eventually I got to his written works and I read everything. No mermaids. At first, I thought I'd trace it back to Alexander Dumas in the early 19th century, author of Count of Monte Cristo, that he reported John Smith as seeing a mermaid. But then I went deeper and I realized what had actually happened is right after this guy, Richard Whitford in 1610 claimed to see a mermaid, an English person had given he'd said that John Smith had seen it. I think because John Smith was a bigger celebrity name, and John Smith himself was well known for always trying to insert himself into things to make himself larger than life. But by doing that, they changed the whole historical record. I was able to kind of find this instance of mishistory, if you will. And that's what really got me going on this. From there, I ended up writing a piece that was like a scholarly article. And then from there, some people started reaching out to me, and I wrote this piece for History Today, which I'll reference more, and it ended up being a cover story. So I thought, okay, it's a magazine. I think I've got something here. And right after that, Reaction Books reached out to me and asked if I wanted to write a whole book on Merpeople. Well, that scared me because it's one thing to write in my wheelhouse, the 17th, 18th century, but this is a lot bigger. And so that's what kind of started me on this journey of exploration with this topic of Merpeople. And it's been an absolutely riveting one. Whenever and wherever humans have lived, they've claimed to see Merpeople. And it's something that I still can't explain, but I think has a lot to tell us about who we are. And that's why I named this book, Merpeople, A Human History, because it's about Merpeople, but it's really about us and what we're projecting onto these mythical creatures and what it tells us about the human condition and what we want and how that changes over time. So I have my kind of general thesis. This book uses merpeople to gain a deeper understanding of one of the most mysterious, capricious, and dangerous creatures on Earth, humans. And kind of one of my taglines now in my life is merpeople are everywhere. I see them everywhere now, especially here in San Diego. I was walking around Old Town this morning, and it's just everywhere. I was pointing them out to Brian yesterday when he was bringing me around. It's kind of good, but they really are everywhere, and they become this almost ubiquitous part of our lives, whether we realize it or not. And a big purpose of this book is to try to uncover why that is. What do we what are we so interested in about them? Why we have all these mythical creatures and interesting animals? Why is it that mermaids somehow catch us so much? Another bad pun. So this book really traces merpeople from early modern or medieval cathedrals to modern day coffee houses. One of my favorite examples of this is the ubiquitous Starbucks logo. We have Starbucks everywhere. Now, they've zoomed in so much on the mermaid now for Starbucks, you can hardly tell she is indeed a mermaid. But when Starbucks was founded in Seattle, they initially used this image of a 15th century twin-tailed siren. Mermaids can either be twin-tailed form or regular form. I'll talk a little bit more about that. They translated her directly to this, and that, of course, comes from something way before 15th century. You have these ancient cathedral carvings that are almost exactly the same. As I'll talk more about, basically any cathedral you go to in Europe, you can almost always find a mermaid in some form in there. I lead a lot of study abroad trips over to the UK, and I always task my students whenever we go into a cathedral to find mermaids, and they almost always do. Now, this also has something more to tell us about the way mermaids are depicted then versus now, because something that has always been a lure to mermaids is this underlying sexuality, I think. This is something that I wasn't even thinking about that much as I wrote the book, but have realized since as I look more at that this is just, don't get me wrong, I have a slide here, sex sells, but the medieval church, the fact that she was this bare-breasted, pretty voluptuous, sexualized figure in the church meant something. Now, initially, she was presented in her full form on the Starbucks logo, but that becomes brazen for some reason over time. And they've zoomed in to where now you can basically, their hair covers and right here, because it's getting once again to this, both the allure and the danger of these sirens that still kind of lingers with us today. And they're still causing controversy today. I don't know if any of you have followed what's happened with the new live action Little Mermaid. For some reason, people are really worried about a mermaid being depicted as something other than white. Spoiler alert, they've always been depicted in multiple ways other than just white skinned. So the thing I often get asked about is like, where did kind of merpeople come from? And I'd like to give you a clear answer, but there really isn't one. One of the great disappointments in my life, BBC was doing this thing about mermaids and they interviewed me about it. And I didn't tell them what they wanted to hear about early mermaids. They kind of cut me out. It's fine. But because they wanted me to give them this like clear idea about where ancient mermaids came from. But the fact of the matter is we don't really know. You have mermen depicted here. This is as old as the 8th century BCE in modern day Iraq. Ons blessing the fleet, a god. Mermen were around. They would also have kind of like what they call nereids with them, these women who they weren't fish-tailed, who would accompany them. Sometimes people try to say it's, goes back to Odysseus with the sirens, but the sirens were these bird creatures. They weren't fish-tailed. They weren't our idea of what a mermaid is today. There are other kind of vague representations of these sea monsters, Scylla, but not what we think of today. And what I argue is that when our idea of a modern mermaid actually you have to go back to the early Christian conversions. Christianity starts to come into the picture and they start to have more, connotations with, not with the sea, which is something they took from other religions. And they start this idea of fish and these kind of hybrids start coming in. So this is 280 CE, you have Jonah being swallowed up here, Jonah cast up, and he's almost has this serpentine tail here. Roman funerary plaques, you can still see them today. A symbol of that they were Christian would be the fish, but it's still really murky. They finally take their modern form with the medieval church. Now, conversely, the medieval church used the sex as a bad thing. Medieval church and their psalters and bestiaries and very carvings in their church were depicting these, what would have been considered very lewd figures at the time. You see here that these women in this depiction, a bare-breasted woman, oftentimes they would carry a mirror in one hand and a comb in the other, perhaps reflecting their vanity. Here you have the spread-tailed mermaid. Now this could be used for very sexual purposes. I didn't put on here, but I found instances of actually like Sheila McGig, twin-tailed, spread-tailed mermaids with actually the Christian fish penetrating them. It gets very graphic in some of these instances. And here, of course, you have this classic idea of these sirens who are coming to drag men to the depths and destroy them. It's a warning off of these male priests in the church to worry about the dangers of femininity, sexuality. It's also, I argue, part of this kind of decentering of the feminine in the medieval Christian church when they start to have this idea of Jesus as this central figure. You still have Mary, but they're trying to kind of push women out of the picture and make being a woman and female sexuality a dangerous bad thing. But you see them all over the place. And this, you have to remember too, in one of these psalters, these Bibles, these were painstaking processes. There was nothing in here that they didn't, this wasn't just like a little fun doodle that they put in here. They thought about everything. They're using gold leaf here to really accentuate her. You do see once in a while a merman at this time, but merman kind of go away. You will see a mermonk once in a while where it's like a little monk in his little robe with his little hair with a fish tail to kind of supposed to represent the other side of this picture, but that's not the case. These priests would see these mermaids as they're poring over their books, but also as they're worshiping in the church. They're carved in the roof corbels, they're carved in the misericords on the benches. They're everywhere. And I definitely have this game now where I'm always looking around for them. There's one in Westminster. There's one of my favorite examples is in York Cathedral, York Minster. You see one inside in the roof, but then you can go up to the roof. And to get up there, you have to walk along this path. Well, when York Cathedral was built, hardly anyone was going to be going up on the roof. Now tourists can. But when you get up there, they have all these flying buttresses up there and these ornate carvings. And I found multiple mermaids up there on those ornate carvings. So I thought, like, who are these for? They're taking the time to do this up there where people are going to see them otherwise. So they're almost just baked into the process there. So I would argue that you have this Christian church creating this dangerous idea of the mermaid. And interestingly, it sticks and it's going to get turned against them eventually. So they create, in trying to denigrate the feminine, they create this symbol of femininity eventually that's going to be used in various ways. Now, this is a map I made. I was joking to Brian about digital humanities earlier. This is about as close as I've gotten. This is, I'm finding all these mermaid sightings in my research, and I'm making lists and checking them twice, with the John Smith thing especially. And I'm able to try to chart where these merpeople sightings have been. So the black are pre-17th century, blue is during the 17th century, and red is during the 18th century. Now, this isn't every sighting, but it's all the ones I could find that are source verified. So this is where I can go to a primary source and find someone saying this. And these were big names saying this. People like Christopher Columbus saying that they saw a mermaid, Henry Hudson, Cotton Mather, Carl Linnaeus is chasing them around the world. Ben Franklin's reporting them in his newspaper. And you'll see here too, though, that they really start to follow empire. A lot of these are English sources, but also French, Spanish. You see them making their way to the East Indies by the 18th century. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise because these people who were growing up in these villages and towns and cities where they're seeing mermaids in their churches and they're hearing tales of mermaids closer to home, as they start to venture out, I would argue they're almost going to be expecting to see them. And not just expecting to see them, but wanting to see them. A point my wife made to me that I had, she's way smarter than me. She said, Vaughn, I agree with her totally. It would be this kind of cultural capital too, to go out and say that you've seen something like this. And it's not totally out of the realm of reason for them to see something like this, as we'll see. Now, I really like, actually, History Today did this great spread. I submitted this to them, and they turned it into this. So my digital humanities, it knows its bounds, okay? They had a professional artist, all right? So, but they were able to take these sources that I gave them and turn them into these certain instances. It was an animated thing on their website. It's disappeared somehow. I don't know if they had a falling out with the illustrator, but I can give you guys a link to this later, but it's, there are all these different reports from people like, John Jocelyn, different magazines and newspapers, of these different accounts of these merpeople. They're happening all over the place. And this kind of gives a good leaping off point for what's going to happen in the 17th and 18th centuries. Because in the 15th and 16th centuries, merpeople are still largely seen as these kind of mysterious creatures on the edges of the earth that represent very much danger and fear. There's something to be feared. Sailors are still scared to death of them. Now, they still are in the 17th and 18th centuries, but that's going to start to change. They're mostly ones saying they've seen them. But as the 17th and 18th centuries start to come in, you have this age of enlightenment coming about. They're also going to be seen as something to be studied, dissected, literally and figuratively, a way to try to order the world around you. So this is where you start to have these more, quote, realistic depictions of merpeople coming in. This one on the left is from a French priest up in Canada. Now, what do you notice about this image? What's the mermaid depicted with? Other realistic, real creatures, some kind of like dragonfly and a toad. So he's drawing all these creatures he encountered up in Canada, and he includes among them this mermaid. And that's not out of the ordinary. You have people like Richard Whitbourne, who I referenced earlier, this English sailor, who not only did he describe seeing this mermaid in close detail, but he was also careful to say, I don't think it was, he didn't say he thought it was a seal or something. And he has other people verify it. And this is something that's always coming in. I didn't just see it, all these other people saw it, and they're more than willing to attest that this is something real. I always liken it, it would be like today if instead of shooting rockets up into space for fun, people like Elon Musk and Bezos were running around searching for mermaids. And it's easy to laugh these people off at the time, but for them, it was about pushing the boundaries of knowledge. It was about pushing into these literal uncharted waters. And they started to come up with these ideas like, well, we have these ideas now. This guy, Di Malier, wrote a book about how he thought in 18th history, about how he thought humanity came from the ocean, which was pretty cutting edge for the time, and he didn't exactly get a lot of love from the church for this. It was one of the most purchased books for French libraries at the time, though. And in this, he asserts that, well, if humans came from the ocean, there should be mermaids out there. There are these hybrids. Look at all these other weird hybrids we're finding platypuses and, you know, the possum, which absolutely blew people's mind when they found it. It's a little mammal that has babies in its pouch, its stomach. And like, they were finding all these other strange things in the New World. We have all these verifications of mermaids going back thousands of years, Pliny the Elder, all kinds of stuff. People, you know, Alexander the Great, all these people that always said they saw mermaids. We trust them on so many other things. Why shouldn't we trust them on this? And why shouldn't they be out there? So as these explorers and these naturalists and these scientists and philosophers are pushing into these new worlds and colonizing them, they're expecting to find merpeople there, and they are finding merpeople there, at least in their contention. So these are a few examples of people who are saying they're seeing mermaids. So though Columbus found mermaids not so beautiful as they are painted, so this is interesting because he has a firm idea of what a mermaid does and should look like. He can see that to some extent they have the form of a human face. He probably was seeing manatees, is what I would argue. But that's a thing. In a lot of these, I can't say they're seeing manatees. I don't know what, because they don't describe them like a manatee. In 1523, the Swiss philosopher Conrad Gessner contended that a manfish about the size of a boy was seen at Rome. In 1533, the Spaniard Diego Hurtado claimed to encounter a merman off the coast of Polynesia, quote, seen by all the crew near a deserted island 30 leagues from the continent. The merman leapt about in the water like a monkey, with his eyes fixed on the crew like a creature endowed with reason. So they're describing them as just not just these dumb brutes or something, but creatures endowed with reason. Other people are seeing them, about the size of a boy, seen somewhere like Rome. And these would have been people who weren't some quackpots or something, you know, crackpots at the time. They weren't quacks. They were legitimate, reasonable people. So this helps to just keep pushing this idea of what do we have going on here. Along the same time, keeps going, they are literally mapping the world around them. Now, maps are, of course, a human creation. They're a system of power, geography, politics. as people are printing these maps, they're associating mermaids with certain areas of the globe and mermen, especially off the coast of something like Africa, maybe in the far east, tip of South America, places that still weren't quite as explored and discovered by Europeans. They're painting merpeople there. Now, this was for two reasons. One, someone who's wealthy could just pay extra money to fill in some of the gaps in the ocean. I'm not going to act like that wasn't happening. But I think there's some deeper reasoning there too, where that it's a way of depicting certain places as more wild, savage, untamed. And in doing so also, it keeps hammering this idea of merpeople. Okay, so when you're hearing people say, you're going somewhere and you're hearing people say they see mermaids, then you're reading about important people saying they see mermaids, then you're seeing mermaids on maps. It keeps building up this idea of reality. And it wasn't just imagery. So I have here the popularity of mermaid specimens, especially hands, ribs, and other portions of skeletons, grew during the 18th century. One collector in Middlesex, England, said the rib of a triton or merman in his private, said he held the rib of a triton or merman in his private collection in 1713. While in 1722, the English geographer Patrick Gordon claimed to have viewed mermaid hands in the repository of natural rarities at Leiden and the Museum Regium at Copenhagen. The Royal Society of London also held pieces of mermaid skeletons in their collections, listed among their collections. So they're constantly getting more and more legitimacy during the 18th century. And I can't stress enough that it wasn't a thing of ridicule. Yes, there were people saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? Like, I don't think this is real. But more and more people, and I would say the majority of thinkers and common people, did indeed foster these deep beliefs in these creatures. Now, this is also important too, because we're talking about ordering the world around us. In 18th century Europe, a huge part of, especially a philosopher, a gentleman's persona was having a cabinet of curiosity, where they collect the world around them, organize it, and put it in its place. And this was a huge part of the Enlightenment. Everything needs to be ordered. Everything needs to have its place. Now, merpeople pose a real threat to this, because were they human or were they fish? Where do they fit? What does it say about being human? That's why someone like Carl Linnaeus eventually is going to be so interested in mermaids. And in fact, one of his students is going to claim to have found a mermaid in the New World and write a dissertation about it, which Carl Linnaeus signs off on. Carl Linnaeus is also sending messages to his government saying, we need to go out. There have been these mermaid sightings. We need to find these mermaids because this is an important scientific discovery. Finally, in the 18th century, these are two of my favorite images here. These are two non-white mermaids from the 18th century. The one on the left here was by this guy, this Frenchman Renard, and basically this is a book about aquatic creatures, shellfish and other things in the East Indies. He was there in the 18th century, and he drew this book up there were no other fantastical creatures in this book. And this mermaid was depicted right among all these other fantastical creatures. This was a legitimate book of science at the time. He claims he caught this mermaid and he put her in a tub of water. He claimed that she resembled the local islanders, so he attributed kind of this island identity to her, and that she refused to eat and she eventually died. Eventually, the Queen of Russia is going to get this book and demand to figure out, like, how is this real? He can never prove it to her. It does get some kickback from a couple of people among his reviewers who are like, wait a minute, why does she include this mermaid? But others accept it. This is by Diego Toy. This is a mermaid drawn with a measuring scale. This was allegedly a mermaid that was caught and displayed in Paris, France. And then they have this pretty famed artist draw it with the scale next to it. Once again, very enlightened. It's almost like just like a specimen. This mermaid, neither of these, this one's a little more along the line of kind of a classical mermaid, but this one's not. This one doesn't look like this mermaid of war that you'd see in a medieval church or a bestiary. This is depicted as this more ugly creature who could possibly be real. Now, interestingly, they also bring race into this, because this is published in the Gentleman's Magazine in London. And they published this, but on the next page, they have a plate of a supposed white mermaid, who's depicted as this beautiful, classic white mermaid. And they contrast it with this ugly black mermaid, and they call it ugly. They try to apply this like early modern racism and racial classification to them. So as I mentioned earlier, mermaids have always been depicted as non-white, but unfortunately, when they initially were, it was as a sign of negativity. It's interesting how people now almost don't want that at all, or still want to make it this negative thing. And I think it's speaking to the enduring importance of mermaids, kind of reflecting us, if you will, unfortunately, in that case. Now, in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, mermaids start to transition into this era of kind of freak shows. Now, this is one of my favorite prints. John Potts, mermaids exhibited successively in the years 1758, 75, and 95. This is that white mermaid I was talking about earlier, next to her quote black counterpart. And then this is another mermaid that was allegedly exhibited in London as well. It's kind of a blend of the two. And I've also found this is a direct copy off of an early image from a map. And I actually found this is a direct copy too. I found that after I wrote the book, which was really interesting kind of discovery. And this is a really great one too. This is from the Illustrated Police News towards the end of the 19th century. The Westminster Aquarium had a mermaid allegedly, but here you have ideal mermaids, dugongs, this Japanese idea of a mermaid, which we'll get to, and then the manatee mermaid. So they have them all collected together as these different forms of mermaids. Now you'll see here that what they had was a manatee, but they're still linking it to like, well, there are these ideal mermaids out there. We're just still going to call this something different. And then there's this mermaid, which really catches hold in the 19th century. The 19th century. Now this chapter was really fun to write. I searched through. I think it was 90,000 hits on newspapers.com was the term mermaid. So I just put mermaid in from 1800 to 1899 on newspapers.com. And it's a lot. And I had to go through each one, and I categorized mermaids according to newspapers. Everything, put them in a Word document. I had a really scary moment because the Word document got too big because I was putting images in and it crashed. I thought I'd lost everything. I had hours, like 30 hours into it, but luckily I had opened it up on another computer at one point, so it was still there lingering. But I broke it down to three phases of Merpeople interest. 1822 is wedded to Enlightenment ideas with a constant spate of newspaper articles on Merpeople. So it's transitioning out of still this kind of Enlightenment era. Now, everything's going to change in 1822. The boom and bust years, 22 to 45. With an average of 4 Merpeople articles per year and a craze for the Fiji mermaid specimens, which ultimately damned belief in them. It both peaked and destroyed belief in mermaids. 1845 to 1900, this age of science and the rise of hoax and fun and kind of art and myth about the mermaids. Now, the Fiji mermaid is the most important here. You see them here depicted in multiple ways. They're these shriveled up little creatures, actually created in Japan. They're half baboon, half codfish, paper mache together with metal in them. Scientists recently have gotten a hold of them and like x-rayed them like real specimens and figured out how they work. I was able to reach out to some of them in this. But this Captain Edis, a British guy, is in the East Indies, and we don't know. This question that has been asked, answered the chicken age question. Were Japanese people already making these little creatures? Or did when Japan was opened up to Westerners around 1822, the Westerners were like, where are the mermaids? And the Japanese were like, there you go. We don't really know, okay? But Westerners were willing to pay a lot of money for them. Captain Edith sold a boat that wasn't his to buy this little mermaid. And he brings it back to London and has to go through customs. It gets held up. Like, what's this strange creature you brought in, like when Johnny Depp brought his dog, or remember that? Yeah. Okay. Well, meanwhile, he rents out the Turf Coffee House in London. He has this big room. And he has all these advertisements for it, and people can't wait to see it. This real mermaid. It's about this big. It either comes in the crawling form or the like standing shriek form. His was in the standing shriek form. People start to come to see it. They're like, oh, what's this little creature? They still have one at the British Museum, by the way, in the Enlightenment room. he also invites scientists to come along and take a look at it. Now, he makes them sign a non-disclosure agreement. So eventually Cruikshank, famous engraver, makes this little image of him, the mermaid, but people start to get disenfranchised with this mermaid. And other philosophers and scientists start writing saying, this is fake. Edith loses everything. By the end of his Little Mermaid's run, it's touring with Toby the Pig, which was like a dancing pig sign. Doesn't work out, okay? Well, 20 years later, over in America, P.T. Barnum gets his hands on the same mermaid, the same little shriveled up creature. And he goes on an absolute campaign with it. He prints out all these advertisements. He's all about it. He promises this real mermaid. In the advertisements, it's a depiction of a mermaid like what people would expect. But then they go in to see it, and they're like, what's this? This big. I have lots of accounts of people going in, expecting something, and then seeing and saying, what's this? Though he does make a lot of money off of it. But eventually, he too is discredited. He sends it on this tour, and basically, the Edith and Barnum peak interest in the mermaids and then crash it down. And from that point on, you have all these, I mean, you literally have articles in newspapers where they're going to these people who are making the mermaids and ask them how they're made. And they're giving them all the information. This is an image from one of those where they, here's how you make it. And so they know that these aren't real specimens. You do still have accounts of mermaid sightings though, but it's now they start to kind of link them with like hoaxes, and they start describing the American Civil War as a mermaid, the North and South, two sides, two incongruous sides, you know, so they start to have more of a connotation with tomfoolery and hoaxes or just art and fun. Now, modern day 19th century, around the early 19th century, there are huge parts of modern art. You have this romantic movement coming in. You have some beautiful pieces by people like Waterhouse. This is a depiction of Odysseus with the sirens, very different from the earlier Odysseus and the sirens image we saw, where he's tied to the mast on the pot. Now he's, you know, you have this very idealized, and interesting too, she has legs, she doesn't. So I'm wondering if you got some kind of thing where she gets out of the water, she loses her legs, I'm not sure. And then this is a very classic image of the mermaid. She's combing her hair. You can't see her, she's got her pearl beads here. These romantic, Tennyson started writing different poems about mermaids. Songs are coming out. They're very much these muses, if you will, for creativity. Now, they also, though, start to be tied into this idea of a modern mermaid, a strong woman, a strong, assertive woman. And this is because of a woman named Annette Kellerman. Annette Kellerman's born in Australia in 1887. She's a great swimmer. She moves to England in 1906 and does this race in the across the channel. Gains a lot of popularity and notoriety for that. So then she moves to America with her dad because she thinks she could star in films and become a big celebrity in America. And that's what she does. She was a pioneer. She popularized the one-piece swimming suit, was deemed the perfect woman, not just by the media, but by the head of Harvard physical education. Sat down and measured her out and said, this is the ideal perfect woman, physically. Very early 19th century, 20th century of them. I said 19th, early 20th. Started a number of aquatic-based films, opened her own movie production business, became one of the first mainstream actresses to perform nude on film, and acted various vaudeville shows. One of her most popular characters was English Johnny, in which she performed as a man. So she's both like bending, you know, she's half human, half fish. She's also, you know, performing in, you know, gender bending, as you know, at the time. But so this is an image of her. This is Annette on swimming. She ran her own swimming classes. But for a woman at this time to do all this, and they described her as a mermaid, Annette Kellerman. She played a mermaid in films, and she was constantly described as a mermaid. So she starts to take this idea of what it means to be a mermaid. She's pushing back. She's using her sexuality. She's very open about that, and she's using it as a form of power. And she's pushing back against these very like, medieval, early modern ideas of sexuality and gender. Now, as she's doing that, especially by the second half of the 20th century, mermaids are also becoming very, very sexualized in media, advertising, film. You have the chicken of the sea mermaid, very still the tuna. Splash here. I mean, this is 1986, I think somewhere around there. She was the woman of Alan's dream. She had large dark eyes, a beautiful smile, and a great pair of fins. Okay. This is a 1920s advertisement for Schweppes table waters on all Eagle steamers who are going up and down the River Thames. Features a topless mermaid, which was pretty crude for the 1920s. And then these two movies come out in the 1950s. Now, in Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, especially, very troublingly, it's about this guy, Mr. Peabody, who catches a mermaid and he keeps her in a pool at his resort, and she can't talk. And so he comes and sees her at night, and like teaches her how to kiss, and she's his little captive, and he escapes at the end. Miranda is captured, but she gets away at the end and actually has a baby with the human, and that's the way she's depicted at the end. But there you have these boom and these mermaid pictures. These were both filmed at Weeki Wachee Studios in Florida, which is a big aquarium tank where they still have mermaid exhibits today. But you have this very, mermaids now have also been very sexualized. And there are so many in the book of all kinds of crazy stuff I found with this. Very stuff that was published in the 1950s in newspaper ads that people today, a lot of main society would be like, whoa, this is too much. Now, finally, my final chapter, I go global. So I go beyond the Atlantic Ocean of Western Europe and North America, and I start looking into how merpeople are this global phenomenon. No matter wherever or whenever people have lived, they have found or created mermaids. These are two examples. They're kind of similar. This is ancient South African rock art from the Karoo Desert. Merpeople, finned creatures. Now, this was a place where there wouldn't have been a lot of water. We don't know why exactly they were depicting these mermaid creatures, maybe as a way to bring water on. And this is from Henry Schoolcraft, as he's going in the early 19th century to Native American tribes up in the great northern, Great Lakes region, present-day Canada. This is one of their Native American tribes, one of their deities, Myongum, and is depicted as a merman as well. You have other Native American depictions that go deep into indigenous peoples' society. I have more. This is a Nino from 1803. Now you'll notice that this is Japan. This isn't our modern day idea of a mermaid. Nino actually doesn't mean mermaid, it means it says a man-fish. But what societies start to do is, as they have more interactions with Europeans, they start to take on some of these European ideas of what merpeople look like. So there's almost this colonizing effect that Europeans have on the culture. It's not just McDonald's springing up everywhere. This is from the 1st century in present-day India, a Naramakara figurine carved in. You'll see it's a merman with these kind of spread tails like we see in other depictions. And this is a bronze plaque of the Oba of Benin, Africa. And this is probably 15th century. You'll see here that his legs are mud puppy fish, a symbol of the sea god Olokon. So he has the kind of same spread tail here too. Finally, this is Vishnu in his incarnation of Matsya, fighting with a demon in the 19th century. Now, interestingly, it's depicted as kind of like with a Jonah cast up, where the fish is kind of eating it, but it still has the fish tail. And meanwhile, this is from the Mayan Dresden Codex, 13th century. It's kind of hard to see here, but the same thing's happening here. We have this fish-like creature kind of consuming this man. There's a lot more in the book, but what I'm trying to get at here is you have all this folklore and myth of sirens coming out, the Rusalka in Russia, attacking men, or depictions of women and men as half fish, half human. And it transcends just Western culture. But Western culture, I would argue, in the 18th and especially 19th century, starts to affect these other cultures, ancient ideas of sea people, mer people, water deities, and they start kind of drawing them. I have another one from Thailand that does something similar. So I argue here at the end, this enduring narrative, from alleged sightings to merchandising to self-expression, merpeople continue to challenge humankind's perceptions of person and place. Importantly, they seem to become more human over time as we instill our own hopes and shortcomings on these fantastical hybrids. As the lines between humans and merpeople continue to blur, our own hybridity will become more apparent. Monstrous yet beautiful, mysterious yet predictable. Humans and merpeople are not as different as many like to think. And with that, I am done, right at 42 minutes.